Will there be a fourth wave of COVID-19, and is a federal election call just around the corner? Here to discuss this and more is our federal political contributor, Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley. Brian, thanks for joining us again. So great to have you on.
Oh, my pleasure as always, Jeanette.
Thank you. So, Brian, an election call could come as early as this weekend. So, Brian, what are candidates, staffers, and journalists being told in terms of getting ready?
Well, staffers were probably warned before anybody else. They were told back in, I don't know, late May, early June on the Liberal side. They were warned, okay, get your vacation time. If you need downtime when Parliament rises at the end of June, get it out of the way in July because you need to be back in Ottawa for early August. And then a couple of weeks ago, candidates were told, rent office space for the next 2 months. Okay, well, that's a pretty good sign of an election. As for journalists, very few of us being told what will happen other than, yep, they plan on having rallies. They plan on going coast to coast to coast, as they like to say. But, okay, how exactly is it going to happen? How will the campaign tours and buses work? That part we don't know.
Right.
But all systems still seem go for a call that could come this weekend, and if not, the following week. Because remember, those $500 checks start going out to seniors the week of August 16th, and they don't want those going to waste. They want people to get a check and then think, oh, vote Liberal.
Interesting. So now, speaking of which, the Liberals have had some gains in certain polls. Others have been tighter with the NDP surging and the Conservatives nipping at the Liberals' heels. So what do the parties need to do in order to win or change the situation from what it is now?
Yeah, the polls have been a bit of a mixed bag. There were a bunch of polls towards the end of June showing a wide lead, and there's been one or two since then from firms that I don't really use. A lot of the firms that I do use, such as Angus Reid, Ipsos, Leger, they're showing a tighter race now of between 3 and 5, 6 points. That's kind of the range as opposed to back, a while ago, it was 12 to 15 points. It'll be a blowout. So it's tighter. Okay, so what does that mean, though? Because we know that the Liberals aren't necessarily going to do well in somewhere like where you're sitting in Alberta. We don't know what the NDP surge could mean if it hits here where I'm sitting in Toronto. So the NDP, a surge for them is about 20%. They need to tighten down areas like where I am in Toronto. They need to make sure that they are competitive in industrial cities and heartlands across the country. They also need to make sure that they're competitive in BC. BC is going to be a three-way race, so that's going to be interesting. So all of that's going on. For the Conservatives, they need to make sure that they've got enough negative stuff in the window about Justin Trudeau, but that they also have enough positive things that Erin O'Toole is going to be able to say, all right, you don't like that guy? Here's an alternative. There are a lot of people that don't like Justin Trudeau. They're already not voting for him or they're holding their nose. You need to give them another reason. You know, I've been talking to a few pollsters who say they don't know why Trudeau's going to the polls because they don't know what his ballot question is. And I keep saying it'll be a variation of Stevie Wonder's Isn't She Wonderful? Turn to Isn't He Wonderful? And they'll just sing that over and over again. There's no real reason for him to go to the polls other than they want a majority government again. I don't know what their value proposition to voters will be. So it's going to be an interesting race, assuming we get there.
Oh, it will be so interesting. Now, it's funny because you're saying you're sitting in Ontario, I'm sitting in Alberta. In the West, we often say the election is decided before the polls even close out here because of the size of Ontario and Quebec, naturally. So if we do have an election, do you expect that to happen again this time, Brian?
No, because I think there could be seats in play in Alberta. Right now, I think, isn't it every seat is held by the Conservatives or all but one?
Pretty much, yes.
And
Yeah.
it, but okay, what is going to happen with the Maverick Party? We know that Erin O'Toole and his Aaron Bucks carbon tax program have alienated a lot of the Western voters with the Conservative Party. I've heard from people who have been stalwarts of the Conservative Party saying, I'm thinking of voting Maverick this time. So if that happens, does that peel away enough votes that the Conservatives lose? If it happens in Calgary or Edmonton, that could definitely be the case. If it happens in Lethbridge, less so. I don't expect the People's Party of Canada to be much of a um, much of a factor. They weren't in the last election, and nothing's changed to make it different. But Maverick could be a real game changer on the prairies in terms of votes. But as I mentioned earlier, British Columbia is going to be a three-way race. So they're all very tight by the polls that I'm reading, the polls that I trust. They're all very tight. Justin Trudeau, when he won his majority in 2015, took about half of BC's seats. He's going to have a great deal of difficulty doing that the way things sit now. He's got, I think, about 7 to 10 seats. He got 17 back in 2015. He needs those to get his majority because maybe pick up one in Calgary with a councillor for a guy that wanted to be on council running. Maybe if he convinces former Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson to run, maybe he picks up one there. But he's not really going to win there. He's not going to win in Saskatchewan. And his base, his support in Manitoba is tenuous. There are not enough seats unless he sweeps Ontario. There are not enough seats in play for him to easily get that majority. So he needs to find seats in Western Canada. Western Canada will matter this election for both leading parties, not just the Conservatives.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see what happens for sure. Now, Brian, you say one key clue that the Trudeau Liberals won an election is that they are talking about abortion again. So why does that point to an election?
Because the Liberals talk about abortion more than any pro-lifer I know. They talk about abortion more than pro-life activists that I've known for a long time. And they really talk about abortion when it's time for an election. So Justin Trudeau went to New Brunswick last week. He started talking about how he would withhold millions of dollars in funding from New Brunswick because they won't fund a private abortion clinic there. It's a small province. They have three main hospitals they're the only ones that do a lot of procedures. And they're the only ones that do publicly funded abortions. Well, this has always bothered the Liberals. They want private clinics to do abortions, like the Morgentaler Clinic that is steps from Parliament Hill. So, by the way, it turns out that they were only withholding about $140,000. They keep raising this issue because they knew that late last week, Aaron O'Toole, the Conservative leader, would be swinging through. So he gets asked about the issue and he says, look, I'm pro-choice, but I'll leave it up to the provinces to decide how to spend healthcare dollars. All of a sudden, Justin Trudeau's tweeting about, don't take away a woman's right to choose. This is sacred. Men shouldn't have a say. Well, who was talking about that? Oh, I know. Justin Trudeau was. But it gets him media attention. It gets him into the cycle. And it may not win him a ton of votes. It may not switch votes, but it gets his base excited. And often in politics, that's part of what you want to do. And so he wants to get his base excited. He wants to get New Democrats who are really concerned about this issue to say, well, I better vote Justin Trudeau or, abortion's going to disappear across Canada. That's what, every time they bring this issue up, that's why. Not that they're actually going to do anything. They just want to use it as a stick and a carrot to try and get votes.
Okay. Brian, COVID will likely play a role in this election, right? So some people will give the Trudeau Liberals credit for their handling of the pandemic, while others, of course, will blame them. But what about a potential rise in cases that some medical experts are warning about? What do you think about that?
Well, that's the wild card. I mean, and I know some of your viewers will be saying, some people are giving Trudeau credit. Yeah, some people do, like they do for all governments. So we'll give them credit. Well, we're in a tough time. The government's doing its best. And then there are the folks that just believe anything Justin Trudeau says. So, yeah, they're going to give him credit. Others will criticize him. But here's the part. The swing voters that might be giving him credit for handling the pandemic may get antsy if there is a rise in cases. Now, look, we could very well have a fourth wave, Jeanette, but it's going to be very different. It's not going to look the same. So we have a rise in cases. It doesn't necessarily mean an increase in hospitalizations. It doesn't mean an increase in deaths because so many people are vaccinated. So many people have had COVID. There is a natural immunity and there's a medical immunity through the vaccination. So it's not going to be the same sort of wave. But the people that are so nervous about this that they want to hug on tight to whichever government is in power are the ones who might get really upset and say, we're having this rise in cases because you called an election that sent people scurrying across the country, knocking on doors, holding rallies, and they're going to blame him. I normally don't believe in calling an election early gets the government punished. There's a couple of rare examples in Canadian politics, and people point to one in Ontario back in the 80s, but that's a rare exception. But in this case, with the pandemic still lingering and people still nervous, especially here in Ontario, that could definitely hurt
Mhm.
Justin Trudeau.
Now, you said something interesting. You said that it could look very different this time. So if there is a fourth wave of COVID, Brian, do you think that we are going to see a return to lockdowns and those high death rates? Or you're thinking it's going to look different because of all the vaccinations? What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, even the third wave looked very different than the first and the second in terms of deaths. Yes, hospitalizations went up, including in Alberta, including Ontario, and many parts of the country. Hospitalizations went up, and there was a strain on the healthcare system. We're talking about more than 80% of the population age 12 and over having their first shot. We're closing in on more than 70% of the population age 12 and over having both shots.
Yeah,
Yeah. Could it be higher? Sure. But there's always going to be some people who can't get the vaccine due to allergies, due to medical conditions.
absolutely.
They may be
Yeah.
immunocompromised, or they're against it and they don't want it. And you can't force people to undergo a medical treatment. That is not something that I think should stand in a free and democratic society. So we're over 80%. It'll keep creeping up a little bit at a time over the next few months. So that should be enough to say that even if cases rise, the deaths and the hospitalizations won't go in sync. In the United Kingdom, they have been seeing a rise in cases since May. They have not seen a corresponding rise in hospitalizations and deaths. They started going through their latest wave. I think it's their third. They didn't have a third wave at the same time we did. It came later. They started going through that with a much lower rate of protection from the vaccine, and it still worked very well. We're ahead of them. So, yes, brace yourselves. The Ontario chief medical officer said the other day, we need to normalize that some people are going to have COVID and they're going to have to stay home because they're sick, just like other respiratory diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good news what you're saying too about the UK, and hopefully that is a reflection of what's going to come for sure. Now, something that's been in the news a lot lately, there's been a big push to get Afghan interpreters who helped Canadian troops during our war effort there settled back into Canada. But while veterans have been pushing for this to happen, the opposition says that the Trudeau government has been dragging their feet or dropping the ball. So what happened over the last week with a website set up to help them and a false deadline?
So yeah, it was a bizarre thing last week that happened. Look, the Conservatives have been on this for a while now. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has jumped on
Yeah.
board, and I can tell you that veterans have been running ad campaigns. They've had them in my paper in the Sun on a regular basis for a couple of weeks now, saying call Immigration Minister Marco Mendocino, tell him that we need to get these people into the country. They were there for us. We need them in. But the Trudeau government, they were slow on this. They didn't want to do it. There had been a program years ago under the Harper government, and I'm told about 1,200 people came through. Now, that program eventually closed because no one was applying anymore. But what's changed? Well, the Americans have withdrawn, and the Taliban is resurgent. And so there are still some people who are at risk. And the hope is they were there for us, bring them into Canada. The Trudeau government didn't want to do anything. Then when they did, they announced in the middle of last week, we'll bring in a new program, but you've got 72 hours. You've got until this Saturday to apply and have your application done in full. They sent out documents that they had spelling mistakes. They didn't have Government of Canada logos on them. Communications in Afghanistan are spotty at best. And if you're in hiding from the Taliban and you're getting these documents, you might be looking at them and saying, are these real? Because, I'm worried that I'm being tricked into coming out of hiding. They
Absolutely.
dropped they dropped the 3-day requirement, but the website that you were supposed to apply on crashed. There've been so many problems with it, and the Trudeau government just hasn't seemed like they've got their heart in it for reasons that I can't understand. These were people that were there for us. I know people, both military and journalists, who relied on them when they were in Afghanistan. For
Hmm.
us to turn our backs now seems awfully cold.
Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today. Always appreciated.
Thank you.